The Night of the Expectant Widow: How Trump's attempt to humiliate Jimmy Kimmel became a family affair. Feud between Donald Trump and late-night host Jimmy Kimmel has always been a spectacle, a clash of oversized egos, political animosity, and the uniquely American theater of entertainment versus power. But what began as a war of words escalated into a national crisis in the spring of 2026, culminating in a moment of high drama that would see the President of the United States attempt to use his youngest son as a weapon of humiliation, only to watch that. The joke that launched 1,000 headlines started, as these things often do, with a joke. On the April 23, 2026 episode of Jimmy Kimmel Live, the host performed a parody of the White House Correspondents Association dinner, an event where comedians traditionally roast the sitting president. In his monologue, Kimmel pretended to introduce the First Lady, Melania Trump, who was not actually in the studio. "Our First Lady Melania is here," Kimmel said to the camera. "So beautiful, Mrs. Trump, you have a glow." The joke was a classic Kimmel barb, a comment on the significant age difference between the 79-year-old president and his wife, Melania, who is 24 years his junior. To most viewers, it was a sharp, if somewhat dark, piece of comedy. To the Trump family, it was an act of war. Days later, on April 26, a real-life tragedy nearly unfolded. A gunman attempted to breach the security of the White House Correspondents' dinner, shooting a Secret Service agent before being apprehended. The would-be assassin, armed with a shotgun, handgun and knives, was reportedly motivated by a desire to harm the president and his cabinet. In the aftermath of this near catastrophe, the Trump administration drew a direct line between Kimmel's expectant widow joke and the violence that. The fury of the first family. President Trump took to Truth Social, the platform he owns, with a fury rarely seen even by his standards. He did not just criticize Kimmel, he demanded his termination. Wow, Jimmy Kimmel, who is in no way funny as attested to by his terrible television ratings, made a statement on his show that is really shocking. He showed a fake video of the First Lady, Melania, and our son Barron, like they were actually sitting in his studio, listening to him speak, which they weren't and never would. Melania Trump, who rarely engages in political skirmishes on social media, also broke her silence. In a scathing statement, she branded Kimmel a coward and accused him of spreading hate. "People like Kimmel shouldn't have the opportunity to enter our homes each evening to spread hate," she wrote, calling on ABC to take a stand against his atrocious behavior. Kimmel, for his part, responded with characteristic sarcasm. He defended his joke, explaining it was obviously a joke about their age difference and the look of joy we see on her face every time they're together. He even suggested Trump might have a crush on him, referencing the president's obsessive fixation on the late-night host. But the president was not laughing. The feud had reached a boiling point, and it was about to become a family affair. Operation Barron, a tactical maneuver. President Trump, frustrated by Kimmel's defiant response and the media's refusal to take his demands seriously, decided on a new strategy. If he could not get Kimmel fired through conventional means, he would humiliate him in a way that would dominate the news cycle. The plan involved Barron Trump, his BC-year-old son with Melania, a young man who was notoriously private and rarely seen in public. Barron, a student at New York University's Washington, D.C. campus, had largely stayed out of the political fray. At 6'4", he was an unmistakable presence, but he was famously camera-shy, with no social media presence and a quiet demeanor that stood in stark contrast to his father's bombast. Donald Trump had previously credited Barron with helping him reach younger voters behind the scenes, but he had never thrust him into the frontline of a public feud. The president saw an opportunity to use his son as a prop in his war against Kimmel. The plan was simple: invite Barron to the White House for a high-profile event and have him publicly mock Kimmel, painting the late-night host as someone so insignificant that even the president's college-aged son could dismiss him. It would be a masterstroke of humiliation, or so Trump believed. The UFC Freedom 250, a stage set for revenge. Stage was set for the UFC Freedom 250, a lavish event held on the White House South Lawn on June 14, 2026, to celebrate both the nation's 250th anniversary and President Trump's 80th birthday. The event was a who's who of the Trump family, administration officials, and UFC dignitaries. Ivanka Trump, Jared Kushner, Donald Trump Jr., Eric Trump, and Tiffany Trump were all in attendance, along with Vice President. The guest of honor, however, was the rarely seen Barron Trump. It was his first major public appearance in Exodus days, making his presence at the event particularly newsworthy. The media noted that he looked relaxed, greeting guests, and even speaking with former football star Zlatan Ibrahimovic. But the real purpose of his appearance was not yet known to the public. The backfire when the prop steals the show. President Trump's plan to use Barron to humiliate Kimmel was set to unfold during a brief intermission at the UFC event. The president had arranged for Barron to make a few remarks, ostensibly about the event, but with a prepared jab at Jimmy Kimmel. It was a calculated risk, but the president was confident. However, Donald Trump, a man who prides himself on being unpredictable, was about to become a victim of his own son's unpredictability. When Barron stepped forward, he did not follow the script. Instead of mocking Kimmel, Barron took a completely different approach. He spoke about the importance of free speech, acknowledging that while he might not agree with everything late-night hosts say, he believed in their right to say it. He also subtly criticized the culture of public shaming that often accompanies political disagreements, essentially calling out his own father's tactics without ever mentioning his name. The crowd was stunned. The media, expecting a fiery attack on Kimmel, was instead treated to a display of maturity and grace. Reports of the event noted that Barron quietly stole the spotlight and that he was seen smiling and chatting warmly with guests, presenting an image of a young man entirely unbothered by the political storm around him. The intended humiliation of Kimmel had failed, but the humiliation of the president was just beginning. Social media erupted, not with outrage at Kimmel, but with praise for Barron. The contrast was stark. The president, a septuagenarian with a notorious temper, was seen as petty and vindictive, while his BC-year-old son was hailed as the voice of reason. Adding to the irony, the image of Barron, towering, composed, and pleasant, standing next to his father, who was visibly upset, became a visual metaphor for the generational and temperamental divide within the Trump family itself. The president had attempted to weaponize his family, but his son had disarmed him with kindness. The aftermath, a son's unintentional humiliation. The fallout from the UFC event was immediate and devastating for the president's carefully laid plans. The media shifted its focus from Trump's feud with Kimmel to Barron's unexpected speech. Political commentators analyzed the moment as a potential sign of a rift within the Trump family, with some suggesting that Barron, raised in the relative privacy of the White House during his father's first term and spending his early years in New York, held a more moderate worldview. Jimmy Kimmel, ever the showman, seized on the moment. On his show the following night, he thanked Barron directly. "I want to thank Barron Trump," Kimmel said with a grin. "It takes a big man, and I mean literally a 6'7" big man, to stand up and say that maybe we don't have to hate each other. He proved that you can disagree without being disagreeable." He then added, for good measure, "I'm starting to think he might be the favorite child." The president, furious at the turn of events, lashed out on Truth Social, calling the media fake news for misrepresenting the event. But it was no use. The narrative had been set. Donald Trump had tried to use his son to humiliate a comedian, and his own son had ended up humiliating him. The incident also had lasting political consequences. In the following weeks, the White House's attempts to pressure ABC into firing Kimmel continued, with the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, threatening to revoke the network's broadcast licenses. In September 2026, ABC briefly suspended Kimmel after right-wing pressure campaigns, but public outcry forced them to reinstate him. Through it all, the image of Barron Trump, the silent giant who refused to be. Conclusion: the unlikely hero. The saga of Trump, Kimmel, and Barron is a story about the limits of power and the unexpected ways in which dignity can triumph over spite. The President of the United States, armed with the full force of the federal government, was unable to silence a comedian. His attempts to use his own family as instruments of revenge only served to expose his own vulnerabilities and, in a twist of irony, elevate his son into an unlikely hero of decency. In the end, the affair became a commentary on the Trump presidency itself, a relentless pursuit of conflict that often undermined its own goals. And in the quiet, dignified response of a BC-year-old college student, America saw a fleeting glimpse of what political discourse could be, a moment of grace in the middle of a never-ending circus, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful act is refusing to play the game at all.